SECfans.com. Welcome to week 11. First, we're going to review week 10. You're going to hear a rant from me about the CFP Whiners. We're going to touch on 3 games from last week, and then, check out our review show coming up, I think about Wednesday. So, all right, let's get this thing going. Before we get into our games this week, Husky, I want to talk a little bit about all the whining about the CFP rankings that came out last week with Texas A&M in the number 4 slot. It seems a little weird that I want to talk about this since Texas A&M lost and is no longer in contention, but I think it's a perfect time to talk about this because it's a good time to explain what happened last week and why they were ranked 4th. And I want to get your thoughts on it in a second, but I want to open up with my rant and my complaint, and that is Texas A&M was ranked where they were supposed to be. And it's easy for people to say now, oh, no, they weren't. See, they lost. But that's not the point. The point is the playoff committee is the only group who does do rankings correctly. And by that, I mean they aren't overly optimistic, like you said last week, where they assume you're going to win all your games. They only give you credit for what you've done up until that point in time. They don't weigh names as much, and they don't give a crap about preseason polls. But we're conditioned as fans to see somebody who has a good name, who starts number 3 or number 7 or whatever. If they've got a perfect 0 in their loss column, they belong in the top whatever. And I just am so glad that the playoff committee has gotten away from that mentality and is weighing things like strength of schedule to date. And if we're going to talk about strength of schedule to date, Washington opened the season 6 or 7 games in a row against teams who don't have a winning record. They played one team with a winning record in Utah, struggled, won in the last minute of the game, and then played a team this last weekend again without a winning record. So they've played a garbage schedule. I think it's, even if you include the games towards the back end of the schedule, it's like 70th compared to A&M's 20th. And the last thing I'm going to say in this long-winded open before I turn it over to you is to whine about Washington not being 4th and A&M being 4th assumes that A&M wouldn't have been undefeated with Washington's schedule, which I think they would have, even when they lost to Miss State. And it assumes that Washington would be undefeated with A&M's schedule. Neither of those, I think, are the case, and I think that's why you saw A&M number 4, but I'm going to shut up and let you talk about it for a second.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, there's times for those that are listening to the show that the two of us talk back and forth, especially on Saturday during games. This wasn't really one of them. It was just something where I knew he had something on his mind and wanted to discuss today. But yeah, we're totally and utterly on the same page here. And, I think it's important to really sort of step back and realize what the playoff committee is doing. They're saying, if the season ended today, where would you rank the
Exactly.
teams? Period. They don't care that Washington is undefeated and in line to win the Pac-12 championship. They haven't done that yet. They haven't played the most difficult teams on their schedule, which we can get to how difficult those teams actually are. But, they haven't done anything yet this season. A&M has played kind of a murderer's row, and it wasn't the most difficult schedule in the world. I understand that, but beating Auburn right now, that's a pretty freaking big
Beating
deal.
the crap out of Auburn.
13
on the road.
2-score win over Auburn. 2-score win over Arkansas, who may not be the greatest team in the world, but you know what? Arkansas is 6-3. How many teams has Washington beaten with a 6-win record?
1.
Yeah. Well, it's actually 2 now. Stanford just got.
Oh, that's true.
wins.
They did become bowl eligible. I forgot.
Yeah. So, even games like that you don't think are meaning a lot. It's Washington's only beaten one team with an actual winning record, right? That's going to have for sure a finish over 6 wins. And A&M, they've beat an Auburn team that's 7-2 and may end up in like a PCS bowl. They beat Tennessee, who I know they've faded, was actually a pretty good team. And was there any confidence that anybody else would have beaten Alabama? So, it's exactly what you said. There are a lot of teams even today, right, that would be undefeated with Washington's schedule. The only good team they really played was Utah. We could debate how good Utah is or isn't, but there are a lot of teams that would have beaten the other 7 on their schedule in a lot of conferences. And you can sort of extrapolate that further with the rankings. It's not just Washington versus A&M. Well, how's Ohio State behind them? Well, Ohio State, again, yeah, who have they really played? It's hard to say. They do lose to a Penn State team who's probably pretty good, but not necessarily great. The another interesting one that gets a lot of love, I'll mention, is Louisville. Everybody wants to talk about Louisville and how good they are, and the only team they've beaten is Clemson. Well, or lost to is Clemson, but again, who's Louisville actually beaten? What's their best win? Probably Florida State. Florida State 6-3. What's the next best win? People would say, well, North Carolina State's playing well. North Carolina State is 4-5.
Right.
So, Louisville, again, their only big game, really, the only ranked team they played is Clemson, and they lost it. And, there's a lot of teams that would have beaten everybody else on their schedule. I mean, maybe Florida State was a big win at the time, but it's looking more and more like Florida State may not really be that great of a team. They're just good enough to get by in what is a very, very shallow ACC. And not to say that A&M's perfect, but going into last week with one loss against Alabama and multiple ranked wins, it makes perfect sense for A&M to be where they were. Again, the issue a lot of people get to is they go, well, they're really projecting Washington.
Right.
They're saying, well, I expect Washington to beat at least win 2 out of 3 out of Southern Cal, Arizona State, Washington State. And, I think A&M's fading and they're not going to win a lot of these remaining games. Well, that's fine and dandy, but they hadn't gotten there yet. And the fact that A&M is very unlikely to win the championship game, the playoff committee doesn't care. I mean, we don't know who's going to go to the SEC championship game still. I mean, right now it's pretty much down to Alabama and Auburn in the West, which we'll get to in our preview show. But, last week we really didn't know who was going to go. And regardless of who does or doesn't go, the playoff committee, again, only looks at what's happened in the past. They don't project forward. And the whole conference champion thing, that only comes into play when you actually become the conference champion. From what I've seen, the way they do it, I think it's the right way to do it because they're only handling what's in front of them. I think they take it into account a little bit when you've actually earned a berth in the conference championship. But again, that's only because you've actually earned something. And it's a big reason why you saw things like Ohio State jumping TCU and Baylor. It's why were TCU and Baylor ahead? Well, because of their records going in the last week of the season. But then Ohio State got to say, hey, we won a championship game. And I think much more importantly, Ohio State beat a top 15 team. And the schedules were so poor for those 3 teams in 2014 that thumping of a top 15 team was enough to put Ohio State ahead. And again, a lot of people would have said, well, why don't you put Ohio State ahead of time? Well, the reason is the playoff committee didn't project Ohio State to win or lose that game. They viewed it as if Ohio State hadn't played it and it didn't exist. In the moment Ohio State played it and won it, they completely reevaluated with the schedule that was in front of them. So, everything the playoff committee makes perfect sense. And the way they're doing it, you should see substantial shifts week to week. And there are teams that will probably climb the rankings because of what's ahead of them. The playoff committee is just simply, and I think quite intelligently, saying we're not going to give you credit for the games we think you will win. We're only going to give you credit for what you've done today.
And what's crazy about this is so many people are going to say, well, you're SEC fans, so of course you're going to pull for the SEC team. No, I absolutely, if you reverse these schedules and you put Washington up there, I've harped on this so much that you got to give credit for what has happened on the field, and that's including in a loss, which I think touches on your Louisville point a little bit in that Louisville, win or lose, they haven't beaten a lot of good teams, but they've also looked kind of bad in wins, like against Virginia, which happened right before the rankings came out. But getting back to Washington, Washington's best win is over Utah. Utah beat UCLA 52-45 the week before they played Washington. And this is a UCLA team without Josh Rosen. And that's just, I know that's kind of picking one game out of thin air, but this is a UCLA team that A&M beat. So there's a lot of information that the committee had that they could base these rankings off of, but they can't base the rankings off of information they don't have yet. If you have a front-loaded schedule in A&M and a back-loaded schedule in Washington, Absolutely, that's where they should be because you have to bake in room to move, like you said, and we've seen it every year. Now, if we get to the end of the season and a two-loss A&M team is ranked ahead of a conference champion undefeated Washington, then by all means complain. But that's not what we've seen in years past, and that's what we wouldn't have seen this year had A&M kept winning and Washington kept winning. So it frustrates me a little bit because we've got people that are projecting the same old mentality from the AP and coaches poll rankings where, we look just at record and name, and if you've got a good combination of the two, you're ranked really high. We don't give a crap about your schedule. And we've finally got somebody that's doing it right in terms of how they do the rankings. And people are so hardwired to think the wrong way that they can't even appreciate what's happening as a good thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. We generally do agree, but it's the way it is, right? I mean, they're just looking what's happened in the past. The rankings made perfect sense where they were. It may not have made sense if you were projecting what Washington would do in future weeks, but all these teams are ranked where they should be. I mean, Louisville, I give them credit for having a close loss to Clemson. I mean, that's a very respectable thing. But like you said, they've also had some really close wins against some really bad teams. And another thing that's probably going to play out at the end of the year is you're going to see some of these teams with backloaded schedules, like Washington, climb their way up a little bit. Michigan has I think, a very good chance of jumping Clemson. And that's going to be because, Michigan is going to play Ohio State at the end of the year. And if Michigan beats Ohio State, that's going to be a win that of the caliber that Clemson really can't match with Clemson's schedule. So, maybe if the ACC had a really strong opponent in the conference championship game, that may matter. But in on the other, and it a lot of that's going to come down to right to who ends up in the Big Ten championship game, and that championship game could reorder things. But yeah, Washington's going to move up, and I think the next thing to extrapolate from this, I would be very curious to see if Clemson can hold on to their number 2 spot, given that Clemson does not have a ranked game the remainder of the schedule. They're going to play Pitt, they're going to play Wake Forest, they're going to play South Carolina, and then they're probably going to play either North Carolina and Virginia Tech. They probably want to hope Virginia Tech is the team they play, because if they play North Carolina, that's not going to be much of a bump. And if Michigan were to beat Ohio State and Nebraska in back-to-back weeks, or Ohio State and Wisconsin again to end the season, they have a very strong chance, I think, of jumping Clemson. Now, all that is a little bit pointless because if they end up 2 or 3, they're going to be playing each other anyway.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Y'all on the West Coast who have stumbled onto our little rant here because some salty Pac-12 fan has posted this somewhere. If you want to complain about where the rankings were right here at this point, then do something about opening the season with Rutgers, Idaho, and Portland State. That's Baylor style out of conference scheduling, and I know Washington State's doing something about that. They announced they're playing Auburn in 2018, but when you've got Cal, USC, Washington State on the back end of your schedule, don't expect respect until you earn it. That's what SEC fans have been telling Baylor for a decade, and they keep not earning it. So Washington, don't be that guy. Just go out and earn it because you've got a great team, and you're going to make the playoffs if you win out. So that's the end of that rant. I don't want to take too much more time on that. So I think we've covered it pretty well. The last thing I'll say, the punctuation I put on this is enjoy the ride, enjoy the process, enjoy the discussions you can have week in and week out about the movement in these rankings instead of just complaining about East Coast bias or the SEC bias that actually doesn't exist. And that's a video for another day.